I'm reading from Revelation 6, 1 through 11. Then I saw the Lamb open one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there was a white horse. Its rider held a bow. A crown was given to him, and he went out as a conqueror in order to conquer. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." Then another horse went out, a fiery red one, and its rider was allowed to take peace from the earth, so that people would slaughter one another, and a large sword was given to him. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and there was a black horse. Its rider held a set of scales in his hand. Then I heard something like a voice among the four living creatures say, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, but do not harm the oil and the wine." When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and there was a pale green horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following after him. They were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill by the sword, by famine, by plague, and by the wild animals of the earth. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of all those who had been slaughtered because of the word of God and the testimony they had given. They cried out with a loud voice, "Lord, the one who is holy and true, how long until you judge those who live on the earth and avenge our blood?" So they were each given a white robe, and they were told to rest a little while longer until the number would be completed of their fellow servants and their brothers and sisters who were going to be killed just as they had been.
All right, do I have any people in here that will admit, like me, that you can get really impatient? Anybody? Okay, look at that, most of you. All right, I'll go quick. That was a really bad joke. Wasn't even in my notes. When I set my mind to wanting something, I can be very impatient. My kids can join me in that. They're not in here, so I can talk about this. This last week was spring break for them, and my wife had promised them that on Friday they were going to get to go to a trampoline park. And so Friday morning came around, and I needed help from KJ with something, and so they were waiting on me to finish that. And so as kids do, I heard all about it. "Are y'all almost done? We're ready to go. How much longer?" They want an exact time. And like the good dad I am, of course, I replied, "You're getting to go to a trampoline park. Just relax, be patient," right? And it's easy to tell someone to be patient when it's something like that. They're just wanting to do something fun, and you're like, "Hey, just relax. Like, we're getting to do something fun." But it's different when the cry of "how much longer" comes from someone who is going through something really painful. Sometimes when that cry is uttered, it's really just a guttural response to something terrible happening, and it's more of a cry for help. I just want it to stop, we might say sometimes. How much longer do I have to put up with this suffering or this pain? How much longer until it's over? There is a cry of how long that we see recorded for us in our text today, and it comes from the depths of the souls of saints who have been slaughtered because they have borne witness to the plans and the power of God. This cry of how long has a rich tradition in the scriptures, typically coming from God's people in the face of prolonged suffering, grief, or pain. The question is, God, when will you show up and do what you promised? When will you put an end to the evil in this world? How long? Good morning again, church. If we've not met, my name is Joel. I'm a member here. I also have the privilege of serving as one of the pastors and elders. As you can see, we're continuing in our series through the last book of the Bible, which is Revelation. The last couple weeks, we've been in chapters 4 and 5. Today, we're going to continue by looking at just the first 11 verses of chapter 6, which you just heard read a moment ago. I always try to give you a little bit of an idea where I'm going. So my plan for today is I want to give you a general outline of the book. We've not done that yet, and I think it would be helpful to kind of ground us as we get into the meat of the book. And then I also want to take a few minutes and give you a few of the major lenses that people view the book through. because I also think that would be helpful. So give me about 5 minutes to do that, and then we're just going to get into the opening of the first 5 seals, which is what you just heard read after that. So let me start by giving you a general outline of the book. I've kind of done it this way. You could have a lot more here, but in the upper left corner, if you can read that, that's the prologue. That's basically chapter 1. And then in chapters 2 to 3, you get the 7 churches. And then in chapter 4 and 5, you get the throne room vision, which I'm calling a vision of victory, because you kind of see a pattern of that throughout the book. And then in chapter 6, mainly, you also get the 7th seal. In the first verse of chapter 8, you get the 7 seals. And in between that 6th seal and 7th seal in chapter 7, you get another vision of victory or sealing of the 144,000. We'll get into that later next week. And then in Revelation, predominantly chapter 8, 9, 10, and 11, you get the 7 trumpets. And in chapters 12 through 14, you get another vision of victory. And then in Revelation 15 and 16, you get the 7 bowls, and the same thing again. That vision of victory seems to be final and ultimate. It includes the destruction of Babylon. It includes the establishing of the new heavens and the new earth, which really takes you, that's pretty much chapter 21 and the beginning of chapter 22. And then you kind of get this epilogue where you get some final thoughts from both John and Jesus. And so that's a general flow. I show that because I want you can get in the weeds and get really confused, but when you kind of zoom out and remember the book was meant to be digested in one whole sitting, it was read all at once, you kind of see the patterns and the things that come into play. And so we're finding ourselves in the 7 seals today is where we're going to be able to start seeing some of these patterns. Most people, that's the outline of the book, but the way that's interpreted starts diverging quite differently as you get into the meat of the book. Most people would be in general agreement around the beginning and the end, kind of chapters 1 through 3 and 21 to 22. But in between, there's quite the divergence of thought. So there are 4 major views. If you care about this, if you don't, you can ignore and tune back in just a minute. But the preterist, the futurist, the historicist, and the idealist, okay? As I have said before, all of these views fall within Christian orthodoxy. So let's fight for unity and engage with charity as we wrestle where you might land. What I'm about to give you is a massive oversimplification. But generally speaking, hear how kind of the central chapters are interpreted according to each view. So the preterist would argue that Revelation was written at an early date prior to the fall of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70, which was a big deal for the people that lived there. And so they would say that the bulk of chapters 4 through 20 are actually describing that fall. So they take quite literally the words from verse 1 of the book, that this is a revelation that must soon take place. And so they would say it's primarily a description of past events. And then you have the futurist. The futurist would argue that the contents described in Revelation 4 through 20 are primarily a description of future events yet to take place. Some would start that in chapter 4, some would start it in chapter 6. But largely speaking, there's general agreement among the futurists that the book is predominantly about things yet to happen in the future. That's probably the most common view recently in at least the evangelical American world. So probably the one that some of you have grown up with, but there's a lot of other views in the larger Christian community. And then the historicist, they generally believe that the book is describing different times within the church age. So that would be from the death and resurrection of Christ to his return. And that it's chronologically leading us to the return of Christ that's described in chapters 21 and 22. So that view will often combine parts of the preterist view and the futurist view. And then the idealist, generally speaking, views the book not primarily as a linear chronological prophecy, but instead a prophecy that is more cyclical and kind of repeating itself over and over. So this view would say that the book is primarily using cosmic symbols to describe actual, real, ongoing, and repeated patterns in history. Often it'll recapitulate Old Testament prophecies and ideas to teach never-changing truths about God and his work in the world. Okay, so that's a general, just overview. You also have other views that are kind of described around the millennial reign of Christ. even though it's only like 7 verses in the book, which is why I give you this lens. I think it's a little bit better. So there are many distinctions within each of those 4 camps, but generally speaking, most interpreters fall into some combination of those or one of those. Many, I think, of the loudest voices in our current day have sometimes only interacted with like their preferred view. And so we can get in an echo chamber and speak very loudly and clearly about the view that we espouse. And they can be confident about that. Has anybody in here ever heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect? A few of you? Okay, cool. So here, if you haven't seen it, it's pretty helpful, not just for Revelation, but a lot of things. So this is the idea. It's a visual. It's that when you start studying something, you're at the bottom left corner, and early on, you get really confident. I mean, you're taking in a lot of information. You're reading blog posts. You saw a couple YouTube videos, and you're like, man, I got all the answers. You're telling all your friends about it. This isn't my graph, by the way. But they would say that's the peak of Mountain Stupid. And then at some point, if you're willing to go beyond that and read further and opposing views, you get to a point where you get to the valley of despair, where you're like, I don't know anything. Like, I have no idea what to think about this. But if you continue down the path, they would say you get wisdom, slope of enlightenment, the plateau of sustainability. I'm not saying this is a secular idea and concept, but I do think that there are some commentators of Revelation that are willing to stand on Mount Stupid and be really loud, right? And so what I would say, like what I'm asking for my one warning for engaging with commentators and teachers of Revelation is this. If there's not humility, then let's just maybe just walk away. Like there has to be a level of humility as we engage with this book. And this is the way I'll say it. There were a lot of people that study the scriptures and got the first coming of Christ very wrong. And so let's be careful that we're not doing the same thing. Let's have some humility as we engage. And faithful interpreters of scriptures that have done the study have landed in different places. So let's be kind to one another. So I'm going to put my cards on the table. Okay, nobody shoot me here. But there are parts to me of each view that are attractive, which is maybe why I find myself coming back most often to the idealist understanding of the text. I think that view acknowledges that events described in Revelation can very well be talking about both past and future events, but it tends to emphasize the main truths that those events point to more than the actual event itself. Now, that being said, you can ask Sarah, because I've talked with her some about this, or other people I've talked about Revelation with. If you catch me on a day where I've interacted with or read a very convincing preterist or futurist, I might be there that day, right? So who knows? But here's what I will say. The reality is the more I study it, the less confident I am in some of the details. Because if you read someone convincing, you're like, oh, that makes sense. Oh, well, that makes sense. But the more convinced I am of the big picture truths contained within. And that's not a cop-out. Like, I really do truly believe that's what John wants us to take away, okay? So that's just, I almost did that at the beginning of the series. Didn't really feel like it was necessary. I want to kind of get into the book, and then I felt like at some point it was time to do that. So that's a little intro. Now we're going to kind of get into the meat of the text today, which is Revelation 6, 1 through 11. You'll remember we had John's letter to the 7 churches, and then he recorded for us this beautiful vision of the throne room where we learn of the worthy one, Jesus, who is worthy to take the scroll and open its 7 seals, this blueprint of the new creation, and make it happen. And we see that Jesus is the one worthy, and it's symbolized by this scroll with the 7 seals. Before we even get to the scroll's contents, though, we got to spend some time just taking the seals off. And so that's what John is going to record for us. And so let's look first at the first seal being undone, which is Revelation 6, 1 through 2. And this is what we see. Then I saw the Lamb open one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, a weapon of war. A crown was given to him, and he went out as a conqueror in order to conquer. So this Lamb opens the seal. One of the 4 living creatures says, "Come," which they will say through the first 4 seals. It can also mean to go forth. And John looks and he sees this rider on a white horse holding a bow, and a crown is given to him as he goes out to conquer. Now, some interpreters would say that this horse is Jesus. I was convinced of that when I read that view until I read other views. You do see a similar vision later in Revelation of Jesus riding a white horse. That's mainly where that view comes from, but most seem to believe this is simply describing a horse that symbolizes war and conquest on this earth. And I think I'm convinced of this view mainly because it fits in with the pattern that we're going to see unveiled over the next 3 seals. So you have 4 living creatures. They all seem to be some form of destruction on the earth, not salvation. Each of the first 4 seals is announced by one of the 4 living creatures. They all have a vision of a rider on a horse that is bringing destruction, each of a different color. Maybe some of you have even heard in pop culture of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, right? Maybe you've heard of that here and there. That's where this comes from, one of the places. This idea is actually further rooted in some visions from Zechariah chapter 1 and chapter 6, where horses are sent out to patrol the earth. And again, just like I think we would all agree, even the most literal interpretation would say Jesus isn't a literal lamb with literal 7 horns and 7 eyes. I believe also these horses are used primarily as a literary device. In ancient culture, horses and their riders clearly symbolized power and conquest. Some trust in horses and chariots. We trust in God, right? So it was a clear symbol of that. And in visions of prophecy, this same imagery would be used as a broader scale, this cosmic kind of reality. And I think it's also meant to serve as a contrast to the lamb who, remember, we just saw slaughtered. And that's the way that he conquers versus these 4 horses who come about to bring about destruction in the world. So each of these 4 horses and their riders seem to reveal these realities of suffering and destruction that are a part of the human existence. And no single human can stop it from happening. The vision of the next horse is found for us in verses 3 and 4. And it says there that when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." Then another horse went out. This is a fiery red one, and its rider was allowed to take peace from the earth so that people would slaughter one another. And a large sword was given to him. So regardless of what we think about the first horse, it clearly takes on a negative and destructive tone here with the opening of the second seal. This horse goes out, he's allowed to take peace from the earth, and as a result, people slaughter one another. So if the first horse does describe the evils of war and conquest on this national scale, then it seems that this is describing the evils of personal and vindictive slaughter. This language of one another is a very familial term. This slaughtering seems to be personal. 1 John 3:11 through 12 tells us this, as he talks about the reason, like we should love one another. This is the message you heard from the beginning. We should love one another. Unlike, here's the negative example, Cain, who was of the evil one. The one another there is the same we see here. And then murder, same word, slaughtered his brother. Okay, so this writer is given a large sword to encourage the spirit of Cain that divides and slaughters his own kin. And it's doing the opposite of what the Old Testament prophesied that the Messiah would do, which was to bring peace, the Prince of Peace, to unite and end division. So you see this clear polar opposites. And then if war and conquest and murder isn't bad enough, things get worse with the opening of the third seal in verses 5 through 6. It says, when he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and there was a black horse. Its rider held a set of scales in his hand. Then I heard something like a voice among the 4 living creatures say, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. But do not harm the oil and the wine." Okay, so we're told the third rider is on a black horse, has a set of scales in his hand. As we'll see here in a second, this idea was associated with hunger and famine in the scriptures and the broader ancient Near East. So the presence of scales, or a thing to weigh something around food, wasn't a good sign. So if you paid attention in history class, I don't know how many history buffs we have in here, but if you paid attention in history class, you might remember images of people lining up in the Great Depression, right, to get their allotment of food for the day, their measure or portion of food, hopefully enough just to survive. So that's what's going on here. From the 4 living creatures, John hears a voice shouting out prices, which was also reminiscent of times of famine. So let me show you a comparable passage. In 2 Kings, there's a famine in the land, and this is how it's described. There was a severe famine in Samaria, and they continued the siege against it until imagine this, a donkey's head sold for 34 ounces of silver. That's a lot of money. I think it's like maybe 2 months' wages or something, if I remember right. And a cup of dove's dung sold for 2 ounces of silver. Right, so you can imagine this like maybe The Walking Dead, if some apocalyptic, food is crucial. So people are fighting over it. They're charging a lot for it. That's what's going on here. But a little bit further in the story, Elisha, prophesies that it will turn to a time of abundance in just one day. This is how he describes it. He says, Elisha replied, "Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. About this time tomorrow at Samaria's gate, 6 quarts of fine flour will sell for a half ounce of silver, and 12 quarts of barley will sell for a half ounce of silver." So if you were in this culture, it's now you're getting a lot for a little. So this is very similar language as we see today, but the voice here in Revelation is saying the opposite. A denarius was about a day's wages, and a quart of wheat was about just enough for one person's sustenance for food for one day. So the staple foods, this is pretty bad. Imagine if 3 meals cost you an entire day's wages. Forget mortgage, forget your family. If you make $150 or $200 a day, imagine that being 3 meals just for one person. So this is pretty bad. Now, interestingly enough, we're told that the voice also says the oil and the wine would go unharmed. Scholars differed a little bit on what exactly this means, but the majority seem to agree. It's pointing out that these are luxury items, and they're not touched. They're conveniently, it doesn't affect the rich and luxurious, those who live in luxury in this community. So it seems that this famine is disproportionately affecting the poorer classes of society. This is the furthering of wealth inequality. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. This picks up on a common theme in Scripture that is condemned. Go read Amos if you don't believe me, or Isaiah 58. When those living in luxury ignore the poor and destitute around them, that is not good in the eyes of God. That is a moral wrong. And then, so this is all happening. Famine comes. If all that hasn't made things bad enough, we get the opening of the 4th seal. Look at verses 7 and 8. When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and there was a pale green horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades, or Sheol, was following after him. It's the place of the dead. They were given authority over 1/4 of the earth to kill by the sword, by famine, by plague, and by the wild animals of the earth. That part, they were given authority. That could be just in reference to death and Hades, or a reference to all of the horses as a summary. Sword, famine, plague, by the wild animals. So, this 4th rider, pale green, it signifies sickness and the plague. Think of the little emoji where the guy's sick, that pale green. Seriously, that's the concept here. It's a pale green horse. That's what it signified. And so death comes, and then we're told Hades or Sheol follows after him, and they're granted authority over 1/4 of the earth. As John does, he's hearkening back to the prophets quite often. Ezekiel's one of his favorites. And I think this is maybe hearkening us back to Ezekiel chapter 5. In that chapter, Ezekiel is prophesying of judgment to Israel because they have become worse than the surrounding pagan nations. And so similar language of their judgment is used, especially in the Septuagint. So the Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Old Testament that is often what is quoted by New Testament authors and writers. Jesus would quote it at times. And so sometimes there are some differences. And so this is one of those. Look at Ezekiel 5, 2-3. You'll have to see it on your screen. This is in the Septuagint. I doubt any of you brought that with you today. If you did, let me know. I'm pretty impressed. But this is what it says. This is Ezekiel. This is what he's supposed to do. He did always these weird prophetic images. This is one of them. "And you, son of man, take you a sword," the same language as sword we see in our text today, "sharper than a barber's razor. You'll procure it for yourself and shall bring it upon your head and upon your beard. And you shall take a pair of scales and shall separate the hair and weigh it out." So you're going to so he's shaving himself. I thought about doing this for y'all today, but I figured it would be distress for you and me. So we're not going to. But he's supposed to take a 4th part. "You shall burn in the fire in the midst of the city." He's burning his hair at the fulfillment of the days of the siege. And then you shall take a 4th part and burn it up in the midst of it. And a 4th part you shall cut with the sword round about it. And a 4th part you shall scatter to the wind, and I will draw out a sword after them. And you shall take thence a few in number, So there's like a remnant is what he's doing here, and shall wrap them in the fold of your garment. And then the actual prophecy is this is what it's pointing to. Therefore, as I live, says the Lord, surely because you've defiled my holy things with all your abominations, I'll reject you. My eyes shall not spare. I'll have no mercy. A fourth part of you shall be cut off by pestilence, plague, and a fourth part of you shall be consumed in the midst of you with famine. And as for another fourth part of you, I will scatter them to every wind, and a fourth part of you shall fall by sword round about you, and I will draw out a sword after them. Okay? I don't know for sure, but there's a lot of similar language here. And so I think John, as he's done before, is building on this prophecy here with these four horses. It could be that each writer here, like the language of Ezekiel, is given authority over destruction of a fourth of the earth. And those of you that are good at fractions know that that is authority over the whole earth, right? And I think that could make sense because we're going to see next week, there's actually a remnant that will be sealed through all of this, right? We're going to see that next week as these destructive measures go forth. It could simply mean this last horse gets authority over a fourth of the earth, which would just signify it's a measure of destruction, but not fully complete, right? Different views on this. The truth is we can't say exactly what all of this is supposed to signify, except what we can say is that this is describing clearly earthly realities that have existed all throughout human history ever since the fall of humans back in Genesis 3. Like these are just describing famine, sword, murder, vengeance, hate, all of these things, war, conquest. And as we read these passages, we can't help but ask, if you're like me anyways, I'm like, is this the active judgment of God? Is God sending these horses out? Or is this like the passive result of humanity warring with each other and evil doing its work? The answer might actually be both to an extent. There is a clear allowance. There's very clear language of I'll allow or he's given authority. It's a granted authority. It's not his own. So they're allowed in some sense to do their destructive work. But we also have to remember, this is what's the encouraging piece for Christians who are suffering, that this is all happening underneath the sovereign plan of the one on the throne. That no matter what earthly things come, he will not allow those who are his to suffer ultimate judgment or separation from him. And as we'll keep reading, and we're going to see further seals open, it is clear that even the judgments of God, whether active or simply allowed, are all a response to the cries for justice from his people. Look at the fifth seal, and the final one we'll look at today, which I think is meant to ground us in this section. This is where it takes a turn. Verse 4, similar pattern here. When he opens the fifth seal, we read, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slaughtered because of the word of God and the testimony they had given. They cried out with a loud voice, Lord, the one who is holy and true, how long until you judge those who live on the earth or the earth dwellers and avenge our blood? So they were each given a white robe, and they were told to rest a little while longer until the number would be completed or fulfilled of their fellow servants and their brothers and sisters who were going to be killed just as they had been. As much as we would like to kind of skip some of the opening of the seals and these things, and let's just get to 21 and 22, right? Let's get to the new creation story. We kind of want this sweet kumbaya type of story. The reality is that's not what we get because God knows that's not what we need. As uncomfortable as it is for us to confront the evils of humanity in the face, God loves us too much to let us ignore it. And here's the thing, the traditions of the church that have been the recipients of the worst of evils and injustice understand that the kind of God we need is a God who acts and moves. You will learn that as you interact with churches that aren't the majority culture. The black church in America is one of those more recently. Go look at churches that are underground, and they don't worry at all about a God who judges. They're like, please, we want that God. Like, I'll just be honest, it's a little bit of a privileged position to be like, we want a God who doesn't judge at all. Because the point is when there's real injustice and evil happening, like there's a guttural response as humans. We know somebody do something. Go read about injustices that happen and some of the horrors. Often that's why we don't want to look at it, because we're like, that's like something has to be done. We don't just need a therapist. And I go to therapy. Like, I'm not anti-therapist. Here's my point. We don't just need simply a therapist, but a ruling king who will expose evil and injustice for what it is, while also offering a remedy for those who will trust him and repent from their own evil. N.T. Wright says it this way in his commentary on Revelation. He says, unless we lay out the problems to their full extent, no real healing can take place. Unless the ills of the world are brought out, shown up in their true colors, put on display and allowed to do their worst, they cannot be overthrown. Unless the four horsemen ride out and do what they have to do, the scroll cannot be read. The victory of the Lion Lamb will not be complete. We have to let it do its worst so that it can be overthrown and defeated. And the beauty of this passage is that even though evil does do its worst, it's falling under the sovereign hand of a good God. He will somehow take all things and turn it for the good of his people. And the saints in our passage, just as we do when faced with evil, we cry out, how long? Wondering when the Lamb will act finally and completely and put a stop to the evil in this world. They cry out, we're told, from under the altar. That's the first time the altar is mentioned in Revelation. We have to understand the temple to understand this throne room vision. Remember, the temple was a shadow of the real thing. There were two altars in the temple. One was the altar of sacrifice. One was the altar of incense. It seems as if John combines those. And later he'll talk about the prayers of the saints as an incense going up. He also mentions these are the ones who were slaughtered for their faith, just like the Lamb was. So there's this kind of combining of these things, and there's an ask for them to be avenged. This isn't personal vengeance. God was clear, and the New Testament makes clear, vengeance is mine, so you don't seek that personally. This is saying put things to right. That's what it means. It's fixing the brokenness. It's a cry for justice, right? We watch the movie The Avengers, and we don't imagine, like, they're taking care of, they do it, poorly as humans, but they're supposed to be, making sure, there's nobody being oppressed and that there's justice in the world, right? And they get rid of evil. That's more the idea here. And the answer they get, which is pretty fascinating, is that, like, we're coming, but it's not yet complete. The number is not yet fulfilled. There are more martyrs to join them. The reason for this, as the Apostle Peter reminds us, is that God is more patient than we are. When the cry of how long is it answered in our timetable, and Peter implores us, it is not because God does not care or he is not just. It is that he has more patience than you. He is more long-suffering. He so desires humans to be one with him that he gives plenty of opportunity for them to turn from worship of false idols to him. And so when we ask, why doesn't God just do something? It's because he is more patient than we are. Sometimes to a point when you really understand. That's why you hear the language of grace being a scandal. That's what we mean. Oh, God, do something. But as we'll also see, God will sovereignly guide and act. His people here are ultimately unharmed. They're given a white robe. This signifies their wholeness and completeness. And they're told, rest just a little while longer. And I kind of laugh. Little while, all right? What do you mean by that, right? A little while, years. But we know 1,000 years is one day. We can go to that passage, right? This reminds us of the end of the book of Daniel. Daniel didn't even understand all the prophecy he's given, but he's told, hey, go on your way to the end. You're going to rest. This is how Daniel, the whole book ends. You're going to rest and you're going to rise to receive your allotted inheritance at the end of your days. I've got it. Just chill. I'm going to take care of it. So all these seals, depending on your view, we could see these 5 seals as something that's already happened. We could see it as something that's still yet to come, or simply a description of general cycles that happen in various times and places throughout human history. And again, I tend towards the latter view, though I'm open to the others. To me, it seems clear that the 7 churches represent all churches from the time of the cross and resurrection until Christ returns. Personally, I don't think John is doing anything different with the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls. It seems to be the same pattern. And I think if we'll remove ourselves, we love to center ourselves in history. So and even in the scriptures. So it's like if we right now have a war going on, we assume John was writing about us and the war we have going on. Though if you zoom out, like there's different wars and different places and times of history that experience famine and various things. And yes, we do live in an age where now we know more than we used to as it's happening in real time. We have information everywhere, so we can make it fit certain things. So, I think it's describing some patterns and things that happen. Even if you disagree with me on that view, I think what we can all agree on is this. If we have lived any length of time on this planet, and we have experienced any measure of suffering or pain where our heart just cries out, this is not okay. Something is not right. We can relate to the cry of how long. Even if you have not been martyred for your faith, which you haven't, or you wouldn't be here today, right? Even if you haven't been martyred for your faith, even if you haven't experienced active persecution as a result of your faith, the reality is we all live under the curse of sin in this world, and we all, on one level or another, are recipients of the work of the enemy, of the 4 horsemen who ride out. We have all faced that and been affected in one way or another. Even if we haven't been murdered, we've been hated, right? Even if we haven't, had been fully separated from family we love, we've been affected by separation. We've been affected by humans fighting each other, war, conquest, all these things. And we need a good and just God to answer our cries for healing and peace and justice and wholeness. Along with creation, we groan and we long to be made whole. We look at the world and we wonder if God's going to show up and make good on his promise. And I love that Revelation acknowledges and gives space for us to ask that question, how long? But we don't just stay asking the question. We have to look for the answer. See, the loudest answer to the question of how long was answered with the first cry of Israel's long-awaited Messiah when he was born of a virgin. The God-man became incarnate. We're told he took on flesh. The living word came as the savior of the world. With his actions and his words, he's foreshadowing the undoing of the curse. He's turning the hearts of sons to their fathers. We're told that he fed the hungry, that is undoing the curse. He healed those sick with plagues. He was liberating the oppressed. Mary says pretty strongly, he's exalting the poor and bringing the rich low. The concept there that there won't be inequity under his kingdom, right? Zechariah prophesied that the king was coming, and he's not mounted on a war horse, but he's humble and riding on a donkey. Isaiah tells us the government will be on his shoulders, but he's accomplishing this by being put to death by a flawed earthly government. He is going to put the world to right. He's going to fix the evil, not as a distant spectator, but by entering into the world that he had created. Also one that humans and the powers of darkness had turned upside down. He would experience hunger and loss and humanness. He would see injustice up close and personal. He would be the recipient of the sin of others, all the way up to the cross where he becomes sin for us. He would let evil throw its worst punch at him. He'd take it all on himself. He would take our sin as well. Death and Hades will attack him. And it would seem to everyone watching that they would rid the world of his work. But as Jesus lays in the ground to rest, and the powers of darkness dance on his grave, I'm reminded of his words, "No one takes my life. I willingly lay it down," as a sacrifice on an altar of wood to redeem the flawed humans. And his followers must have asked through tears, how long? And we know their question was answered on the third day. As Jesus rises out of the ashes and he brings a story of beauty and glory. The empty tomb shouts out loud, death does not have the last word. Evil does not win. Let the 4 horsemen go. I will redeem them. As he walks with his disciples on the road to Emmaus, he reminds them, hey guys, All of it was about me. It's no different with Revelation. He promises his followers, hey, I'm going to go, but I'm going to be back. I'm going to return to this earth in the same way he ascended to the Father's side. He'll turn it to good. So much so from a heavenly view, you can say, just rest a little while. With Paul, who says, a light momentary affliction. I'm like, Paul, you sure? But in comparison to the glory that is in store, that is true. This resurrection truth changes everything. For those who trust in the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, we now no longer have to partake with the four horsemen. Because we can look at that and say that's evil, but then we look at our own hearts. That's what Jesus gets to in the Sermon on the Mount. Like, we're all at a root, like a part of it. We're part of the problem. But we don't have to partake, engaging in war, personal vindication and murder, hate in our hearts, ignoring the poor and hungry among us, celebrating death. We don't have to partake in that, even the death of our enemies. And we can't do that on our own. But good thing Jesus didn't leave us alone. He gave us the Spirit that raised Jesus from the grave. And so in his power, we can simply join the saints under the altar, crying, how long? We trust you. It is your work. We trust God with the timing and method of deliverance and justice. Revelation 6 gives us an invitation to trust the way of Jesus over the ways of this age. We don't have to continue the cycles of violence, vindication, and death. This last week, one of the world's political leaders repurposed some thoughts from a historian as part of his justification for an ongoing war that he's engaged in. Now, I'm not making a political statement about whether or not certain wars are justified when nations should take action. Like, I have a hard time just staying in touch with local issues of justice, let alone issues that take place all around the world. But here's what he said. Here's the quote. He says, history proves that, unfortunately and unhappily, Jesus Christ has no advantage over Genghis Khan, because if you are strong enough, ruthless enough, or powerful enough, evil will overcome good. So the concept there is that, hey, history proves it's the only way it works. We have to give in. It's the only way we can stop evil. I have to say that I disagree strongly with that take. That may be the way of the Western world. It is not the way of Jesus. Now hear me, I'll admit, if the resurrection of Jesus is a lie, then he's absolutely right. Jesus does have no advantage over Genghis Khan, who was known for ruthless actions against anyone who stood against him. But here's the problem. You can compare Genghis Khan and Jesus Christ all day, but I'll say this. Only one of them is alive. And as Christians, here's the thing. If the way we live our lives doesn't hinge on the fact that Jesus got up out of the grave, then it's really not a good idea. We should pack up and go home. You've heard me say that. We're of all people most to be pitied. But we believe that Jesus did actually get up out of the grave. And he actually is going to return to put everything to right, to enact justice globally and personally. And it's radical. You can't do this by yourself. You can't love your enemy and turn the other cheek by yourself. Good luck. But with the power of the Spirit, we can trust him. We can follow him, even into death, knowing that ultimate resurrection awaits. So how long? I don't know. But I trust the faithful God who's answered before, and I know he'll make good on his promises. We can trust him.